All right, I think we're ready. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out to the first session of the Cathedral's class on heresies. We're going to be doing this tonight and every Monday night in March, and I hope that you get a lot out of this. I hope you enjoy it. If you don't, please tell Jason. No, seriously, if we do appreciate any and all feedback so we can always improve our presentations. So heresies and a history of how people have gotten it wrong in Christianity. We'll start off with the overview of what we're going to be doing. This week, the first week is Christological heresies. Next week is going to be theological heresies. Theology being the study of God, so next week will be errors concerning God the Father. This week is Christology, the study of Christ. It'll be errors concerning Christ the Son. The third week is the dualist heresies. Those are heresies concerning the world and creation, specifically whether the world is good or bad. You won't want to miss that because when people decide the world is completely bad, they tend to take up some very interesting lifestyles. So we'll get to talk about all of that. And then the final week is sacramental heresies. And that one's very important because most of our friends and neighbors in Tyler and in East Texas are not Catholic, but most of them are, however, baptized Christians, which means there are Christians that are involved in one or other sort of sacramental heresies. So understanding that will help us relate to our friends and neighbors a lot better. So we think we're giving you a very power-packed group of classes that will help you understand your faith better, and we're going to try to get started. A couple of notes about this class before we dig into the material. First off, we only have an hour and a half scheduled for each one of these sessions because we all have limits. I'm sure you'll have limits for how long you can listen to me. However, we could take just one heresy out of the dozens we're going to discuss, and I could give you an hour and a half long presentation about that. We could take just one person in the history of one heresy, and they're interesting enough, that could be an hour and a half long lecture. So what we're doing, as Father McLaughlin terms it, is we're galloping through these heresies. We're moving as fast as possible to get the information that we think you need packed into just 6 hours of class. So we're going to start off at a very, very basic level. For those of you that have already done theological or historical study about the great heresies, thank you for coming. We ask you to please indulge the rest of us. The rest of us have got to start slow. So please be patient with us. We will eventually catch up to you, I promise. So this series of lectures is about the heresies. We have to start off with what heresy is. Heresy, I'm going to give you the catechism definition. For those of you that haven't seen one, this is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is our basic compendium of truth. If you ever have a question about the faith and an ordained guy isn't handy, you want to consult this. This is our basic go-to reference guide in the church. The Catechism defines all the terms that we need in the church to understand its theology. I'll give you the Catechism definition of heresy. Heresy is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. Now let's unpack that a little bit. Obstinate. In order to be a heretic, you have to be obstinate. This means the church has to have already told you that you are wrong, and you have to say, I don't care. In other words, you can't be a heretic without realizing it. If the church has not told you that you are wrong, or you're not aware that the church has already judged an opinion that you hold is wrong, then you're not really a heretic. You're just ignorant, which is not great, but it's certainly better than being a heretic. So the church, it would be impossible, for instance, to be a heretic on the topic of what color Jesus' eyes were. We don't know what color his eyes were, and the church has never pronounced what color his eyes were, and we can't find any significance theologically in what color his eyes were. So if you insisted his eyes were green, you would not be a heretic, you would be a weirdo. There's a difference. Secondly, post-baptismal. In order to be a Christian heretic, you first have to be a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you're not a Christian heretic. You're something else. It's important for Catholics to understand that we have two very critical beliefs concerning the state of other Christians. That number one, anyone who's baptized validly is a Christian, and that there's only one church. Therefore, anyone who's baptized is a Catholic. Do you not make a practice of calling non-Catholic Christians brother and sister? Shame on you. You should. They're all Catholics. They may be involved in one or more heresies, most likely against their will and knowledge. It's not their fault, therefore they're not really a heretic, but they're all Catholics. I have lots of Protestants, friends, neighbors, and family, and they're all Catholics, whether they realize it or not. And we need to treat non-Catholic Christians as our brothers and sisters because they are, in fact, Catholics. There's not another church. The early church fathers, who we'll talk about a lot tonight, were fond of saying that if there's only one Jesus, then there can only be one church. Therefore, anyone baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ is necessarily baptized into his universal, or Catholic, that's what Catholic means, church. So, in order to be a heretic, you have to be baptized. If you're baptized, you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you ought to be at Mass, but that's for a different topic, different night. A heretic is a person who's committing heresy. And by the way, heresy is a sin. Like I said, you can't be a heretic if you don't know it. The church must have already corrected you and you had to say, no thanks, I'm sticking with my ideas. If someone does that, the church says, well, it's a serious sin. A heretic is a person who commits that sin. A heresiarch, and by the way, don't write any of this down, this is just for your interest. A heresiarch is someone who leads one of the great heresies. That means arch heretic. If you're a Batman fan, you know about the arch enemies. Arch heretics lead the great heresies. One of the heresies we're going to talk about tonight is Arianism, and that was founded by Arius. Makes sense, right? We're going to study Nestorianism. Take a guess? Nestorius, exactly. Not all heresies are named that way, but a lot of them are. If we know who their founder was, they're named after them in most cases. And I want to also clarify the term apostasy. Apostasy is not the same as heresy. A heretic is somebody who is still Christian. They still believe in Christ, but they have something about the faith wrong, and the church is trying to convert them back, and they're being obstinate. An apostate is someone who has left Christianity behind. They were baptized, they were Christian, but for some reason they want nothing else to do with it. Well, that's beyond heresy. That's apostasy. Apostasy is very, very grave matter, but we're not talking about apostates in this class, we're talking about heretics. So we wanted to differentiate between the two. And I also want to say that in this series of talks, we're only going to scratch the tiniest bit of surface, and we're going to try to keep this very simple. It's necessary to call things by their proper name, and since these are mostly old heresies, they have old names that come from different languages. Some of them are tongue twisters. I apologize, but there's not actually a test. I was kidding. There's no test. Therefore, if you want to know the name of something, you can always look at this presentation later. There are great search tools. The Catechism lists most of the heresies. There's ways to find out, but I wouldn't make it a point to try to learn the names of all the heresies right now. What I'd rather do is have you just soak everything in. You can find the details later, but this is arranged to flow in a certain direction so that you get an idea of how heresy works and why it's important. So we'll just move right along. There's not much time for questions. If there's something of great and galactic importance, then ask, but otherwise, if too many people do that, we're never going to get through this. I'll be around for a long time afterwards, and Jason's here all the time, and he can answer all your questions. So, we're not going to talk about all of the heresies, and the reason is, this is a partial list of the heresies. I think this is about 20% of them, which are actually named. I was talking to one of my teachers. I gave him a call to clarify a few notes for this series of lectures this March. I was talking to him about heretics, and he reminded me, he said, remember, it is amazing how easily stupid people come up with stupid things. He said, I taught high school kids for a long time. I taught them theology, and he said, once you've taught high school kids theology, you'll never wonder again where heresies come from. So this is a partial list of these heresies. We can't begin to touch on all of them. We're only going to touch a few. We're going to touch on the ones each week that give you the basics of different types and different modes of thought. That's all we're going to do. If you want to know about all of them, then tell the catechetics department you'd like a class on Triclavianism, and we'll do it. By the way, Triclavianism is awesome. Triclavianism is I think it's the weirdest heresy of all. We're not going to study it, but I've got to tell you what it is. Triclavianism is a heresy that says that Christ was crucified with 3 and only 3 nails, and if you don't believe it was 3, then you're not going to be saved. So it's an interesting story. So the Triclavians were running around in France preaching this weird doctrine, and so it got all the way up to the Pope. And the Pope became aware of this Triclavian heresy. And this was during the life of St. Francis of Assisi. Now, St. Francis of Assisi had the stigmata, or the wounds of Christ, on his hands and his feet. There have been stigmatics at several points in the history of the church. The most recent one was St. Padre Pio. Most Catholics have heard of Padre Pio. Padre Pio was a stigmatic monk from Italy. He had the wounds of the cross on his body. So back then, the Pope said, well, that sounds very strange. Can we go look at Francis and see if we can tell from his wounds how many nails there were? And he actually sent papal legates to go see Francis, and they reported back and they said, as best we can tell, there were probably 4. And the Pope said, okay, these guys are heretics. So it was a very interesting way to look at this. So the official position of the church is that there's no position. It could have been 3, it could have been 4, but you can't pronounce things like that. It's not the right thing to do. Especially you can't say your salvation depends on things like that. That's silly. So these are some of the heresies. All right, so heresy exists all during the history of the church. It existed in the time of the apostles, and St. Paul wrote this passage. He obviously knew it was coming. He told Timothy. Now, Timothy was a man he had ordained to be a bishop, and Paul is teaching him. You can read in the epistles to Timothy. He's teaching him how to do the job of running the church. And so Paul says to Timothy, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own likings and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander into myths. Well, this is exactly what happened in the case of all these heresies. I don't think Paul's exactly being a prophet here. I think Paul just knows human nature. People are going to get tired of what they know, and there's always going to be restlessness, and people are going to fall into error through restlessness. So, we need to talk about the place of the church in times of heresy. And so I have this. Does anyone know what this image would generally be called? It's an icon, but which one? You had to title it. It would be, yeah, Christ the Good Shepherd, exactly. So Christ the Good Shepherd, another word for shepherd is, of course, pastor, right? So this is Pastor Bonum, the Good Shepherd. And so what's happening here is Christ is carrying a sheep around his neck. Doesn't look like the most comfortable thing in the world. Normally, sheep walk. Thank goodness, shepherds, I'm sure, are happy for that. Sheep are ambulatory and they walk around. If you see a shepherd carrying a sheep, that means the sheep is in distress. It means in this context that the sheep has strayed from the flock. He has gone outside the bounds of safety because the safety is in the group where the shepherd is protecting the sheep. Christ is in this image carrying the sheep back from the wilderness where it could be attacked by wild animals, right? He's also carrying the shepherd's crook. Now the shepherd's crook, this is common to all old-time shepherds, even some modern shepherds. It's a long stick with a hook on the end. Why is there a hook on the end? So that if a sheep tries to get away, you can snag it around the neck and pull it back. Do you think the sheep enjoys that? No, I don't think so either. However, in this image, this indicates the authority of Christ through his church to snag us around the neck for our own good if we need it. So in the course of our life in the church, if we stray from right belief, it is the job of the church given to them by Christ to snag us around the neck and pull us back for our own good, which is why our shepherds still carry shepherd's crooks. Is there anyone in here who doesn't know who that is? That is our recently installed Bishop Strickland. And the crook he's carrying, that's a ornamental bishop's crook called a crozier. Now, I hope I never actually get snagged around the neck with that crozier, but if I ever fell into heresy, I would hope that he would figuratively snatch me back from the brink with his authority. That's what the bishop does. This is why the bishop is called the head teacher of a diocese. He's responsible. Think of all of us and think how out of control we are sometimes. That poor man. He's responsible for all of us to make sure we don't fall into heresy. I don't want his job. I really don't. So, let me tell you about one very simple, concrete way the church exercises the power of the crozier. If you have a Catholic book of theology, this is one that I pulled off of my library shelf today. It's a good book, by the way, The Roman Catacombs and Their Martyrs. Awesome, awesome book. And inside the cover, and I've got a blow up here of the inside cover of a book, because this book deals with faith or morals, because it deals with the substance of the faith, inside the cover it has what's called an imprimatur. The imprimatur is a permission to be published given by a bishop. It also has a nihil obstat. Nihil obstat means nothing stands in the way or nothing obstructs. It's a judgment by a competent theologian of the church that there's nothing heretical in this book. When you're looking for theological books, if they're dealing with faith and morals, I don't mean something like 365 prayers to get you through the year. That's not really hard-hitting theology. I mean, if it's something that's really deep theology, you want to be sure to find the nihil obstat and the imprimatur inside a book, so you know that competent Catholic authorities have looked at the book. And so you can say, this one I don't have to wonder about. This one I can just take as given. As a matter of fact, the Cathedral's having a book sale after the Masses this weekend here. And I think that you'll find that virtually every book that's offered out there will have the nihil obstat and the imprimatur. So when you're reading theology, if you don't want to take the book with a grain of salt, look for the nihil obstat and the imprimatur. It's a good thing to know about. It's the church exercising its authority as the shepherd. Oh, this is a book written by Pope Benedict. Some of you may have seen it. It's volume 1 of his books on Jesus of Nazareth. It doesn't have an imprimatur. Can anybody guess why? Somebody has to say it out loud. No one's going to judge the Pope's book because the Pope is the head teacher of the entire church. Exactly right. We're in a hierarchical church. Authority goes up, the buck stops with the Pope, right? Everybody knows we're waiting for a new Pope, right? Okay, just making sure, All right, moving on. There are penalties that can be incurred upon someone if they're extremely stubborn in their heresy and if they're important, if they're a heresiarch, or if they're someone who's dangerously leading other people astray with their heresy. The church can impose excommunication on them. Now, I really like talking about excommunication, not because I think it in itself is neat, but I think that it points something out about our Catholic life that we all need to think about. Excommunication is the harshest penalty that the church can possibly levy on any of its members, and it is no sacraments. That's it. When we as Catholics think about our sacramental life, we all have to deal with the fact that going to Mass, going to confession, the reception of the sacraments is part of our daily routine. We get used, I hope we get used to it, we get used to it, and we don't think about it too much, and we're always being admonished that we need to place more emphasis on the sacraments. Well, I think one way to put that in perspective is to realize that the harshest penalty the church can ever levy on someone is to suspend the sacraments. So last week we gave a class on elections of a pope, and we told a story about the papal election where the people were waiting for the cardinals. This is back in the 13th century. They were waiting for the cardinals to make a decision. 2 years later, the cardinals still had not elected a pope, and the people were very, very upset. So the people hit upon a great idea to make the cardinals elect a pope quick. They locked them inside the building and took off the roof so that it could rain on the cardinals. 2 of the cardinals died. However, the ones that remained inside still couldn't make up their mind. And so they fought back against the people, and they said, put the roof back on or no more sacraments until you do. All the people of the town grabbed whatever lumber they had, ran out, and put a new roof over the building as soon as possible. Those were Catholics that really cared about the reception of the sacraments. How would we act if we couldn't receive the sacraments? Would we care that much? It's something worth considering. If someone is in need of excommunication in a particular diocese, it's the bishop's job. The bishop can ask Rome's assistance in investigating what's going on, and Rome has an entire congregation of priests glad to help. It's called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's the congregation that Pope Benedict was in charge of before he was Pope. But the bishop still makes the decision within his own diocese. If it's a heresy of global proportions, if it goes across diocesan lines, then the Pope usually makes the judgment of excommunication. Right there on the screen, we have good old Henry VIII, who's a very famous person excommunicated by the church. He was excommunicated directly by the Pope because he decided, heretically, that the Pope was not in charge of the church in England. He was. And so he obstinately persisted in this belief, and because he was dragging many people along with him, he was excommunicated. Everybody knows the Church of England is separate from the Catholic Church, right? We all know that. This is the guy excommunicated. If anybody, it's a great story. If anybody would like to hear more about it, you could always request a class in the Reformation from your catechetics department. Hint, hint. So, is this all just ancient history? No. This is a heretic. Does that look like a heretic to you? It does. Fantastic. She looks like she'll be happy to bake you cookies. So, this is Marie-Paul Guizeret. In 1971, Marie-Paul started a prayer group which grew into a giant international organization of Catholics called the Army of Mary. At its peak, it claimed to have 20,000 members on all the different continents. What Marie-Paul Guizeret was teaching the members of the Army of Mary was that God was not a trinity. God was, in fact, four people that she called a quinternity. That the fourth person of the quinternity was the Virgin Mary, and that she was the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. This is happening in the 1970s and 80s, by the way. This is not ancient history. So, for several years, the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith investigated the Army of Mary, because the church never makes rash decisions. And finally, in 2007, the Vatican decided that, yeah, y'all are heretics. She was located in Canada, so the Canadian bishops formally excommunicated her and threatened every single member of the Army of Mary with excommunication. Out of the 20,000 people, the vast, vast majority decided they wanted to be Catholic, and they left the Army of Mary. Only a few very die-hard members of the Army of Mary refused to recant. They were obstinate. Remember, you've got to be obstinate to be a heretic. And it's an interesting story, a little closer to home. 6 of these obstinate members were sisters at a convent in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And some of you might remember in 2007, the Bishop of Little Rock excommunicated 6 nuns from this convent in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the bishop said that it was a sad but historic day because in the 165 years of the Diocese of Little Rock, these were the first excommunications ever levied. The diocesan spokesman, I like what he said. He said, they became entranced and deluded with a doctrine that is heretical. And he said, church officials immediately went and removed the Holy Eucharist from the monastery last night. Why? Because excommunication means you're cut off from the sacraments. That means they couldn't adore the Eucharist, they couldn't receive the Eucharist, so the diocese sent priests to go clean out their tabernacles. The church is serious about that. So, the face of a heretic. All right, tonight, because we're particularly talking about Christological heresies, again, these are untruths concerning Jesus Christ. We're Christians. We place our hope in salvation through Christ. Christ is ultra important to us. I hope that we don't need to go over why. That would seem to be obvious on the face of it. We're very concerned that our relationship to Christ is correct, and that means our understanding of who Christ is correct. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So, what we're going to do is we're going to touch on 4 different Christological heresies. There were many, many more than this. There are many more than this today. Some of these heresies lasted for 1,000 years. Some of them still exist today. These are complicated terms, but I don't want anybody to get hung up on terminology. We're going to explain all of it. But basically, we're going to talk about these 4 different types of Christological heresy. When we've done that, then I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a person who fell into Christological heresy so that you get a personal idea of what can happen to someone if they fall into Christological heresy. So, first we're going to talk about the heresies. We're going to define them, give you a little thumbnail history of each one, but that's just a build-up to the story of what can happen to an individual. Does that make sense? Okay. So, we'll go on to the first type. Oh, actually, it's important to note that Paul was telling Timothy during the 50s AD, heresies are coming. And he was absolutely right, because the Gospel of John, which is written between 90 and 100 AD most likely, probably around 95 or 96 AD, it's written by John, an apostle. John's already having to do battle with heretics. We all probably know the prologue of the Gospel of John, how it begins. And if you know it, it begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And it's a beautiful, beautiful creedal prologue, and it goes on to state the basics of our Orthodox Christian belief about Christ. From this, we can see that John was already having to deal with heretics who were teaching alternate explanations of who Jesus was, even back in 95 AD. This makes sense if you think about it. We as Catholics do not believe that we live in a vacuum. We believe that we exist in a world which is being fought over by good and evil. We believe that God is the ultimate author and victor of the world. However, because he has allowed through his passive will that evil can exist, we know that the church is being fought over. If Jesus Christ is the most important, then that's where the church is going to undergo heretical attacks first and most ferociously. And that is precisely what happened. That's a picture of John the Apostle right there. So John was really, really young during the ministry of Christ on earth because he was still alive at the close of the first century. This is why if you ever see paintings like the Last Supper and different paintings, he's always pictured clean-shaven as a youth. But then at the end of his life, he was an extremely old man. He probably lived to be a little over 100 years old, which was exceedingly rare in that time. So, this is now the first heresy. This is where we get into terminology. We'll break it down as far as we can. Don't let the terminology bother you. I'm going to have to look at the screen a lot. So, what we have to talk about first is we're talking about the earliest heresies that affected the Christian church. In the beginning, Christians were all converts from what religion? Judaism. So the very first heresies that the church dealt with were heresies that came from Judaism. They were heresies that dealt with incomplete or partial conversion, where someone would make up their mind to become Christian, but not all the way, and they wanted to stay rooted in Judaism. You can read about these very first Judaizers in the epistles of Paul. Paul had mighty, mighty battles with the Judaizers, people that were clinging to the sacramental practices of Judaism, like requiring circumcision for everyone, basically. Before you can be a Christian, first you've got to be a Jew, and Paul fought against them. That was one type of Judaizing heresy. There's another type, and it's a Judaizing Christological heresy. It's a Jewish view of Jesus Christ. Now, this is basically called adoptionism. Adoptionism means that Christ was a man who was in some way adopted by God. Okay? That he wasn't God. He wasn't divine. He's just a guy that grew up in Judea, and because he was a really perfect Jew and kept the law really, really well, something happened. Now, there's a lot of disagreement among a lot of different groups at this time over what exactly happened. The particular group I want to talk about is the Ebionites. The Ebionites, first of all, are not named after a guy named Ebion. There was no guy Ebion. Ebion means poor in Hebrew. Okay? It means poverty. So these were people that called themselves the poor ones. They were part of a movement that had existed for a long time in Judaism of monasticism, living in isolated communities, living an ascetic life of voluntary poverty. If you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know those came from a place called Qumran, which was a Jewish ascetic monastery where monks basically lived a Jewish life with the Jewish laws, and they had Jewish ritual practices. Well, those groups still existed during the early years of Christianity. And then you had groups like the Ebionites who were sort of half and half. They were Jewish and they had Jewish practices, but they were Christian in that they thought that Jesus Christ was something special and maybe even the Messiah. But when you asked an Ebionite to explain in what way is Jesus the Messiah, you got something besides the Catholic answer, right? The most common one being adoptionism. The story would go that Jesus Christ was born like any other Jew, but he followed the law so perfectly that God took notice of him and adopted him to be the Messiah and to be called the Son of God. The Ebionites were really durable because we lose touch with the Ebionites in terms of Christian heresy after a few hundred years. They're no longer afflicting the church at large. But a millennium later, in the 1100s, Muslim scholars writing their travelogues about traveling in the Middle East reported coming upon communities of Ebionites, staying with them, and learning about Ebionite theology. They don't exist today. We don't know particularly when the last Ebionite communities died out, but we know they existed after the millennium. Their isolation, the fact that they were isolated in monasteries, really allowed them to last a long time. This is going to be important. Remember for me that Ebionites lasted a long time. I'll tell you why in a little while. So, what's our basic problem with Ebionism as Catholics? And what was the church's problem with Ebionism? Well, Ebionism, of course, is not talking about Christ as being God. That's a huge problem. They're not talking about Christ as saving. That's a huge problem. Christ is not the lamb sacrificed to save the world. Instead, he's just a man who lived a really, really good life. That means that there's nothing supernatural going on there. This is a big problem, obviously. So, logically, what the church says is, you Ebionites, you're teaching a Christology which is all about Christ ascending, coming up, starting low as a human being, and then moving up to some undefined place as the Son of God. And the church says, we know this is wrong because the apostles taught that Christ did the opposite. They taught that Christ descended, that Christ came down from heaven, came down to save us. Particularly, the particular verse of Scripture that was used by the church when answering the Ebionites was, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men, in the habit found as a man, which is from Paul's letter to the Philippians. And that word emptied there is a Greek word, kenosis, and that's the technical word for what Christ did when he came down. He emptied himself, and what particularly did he empty himself of? He emptied himself of the divine powers of God. Now, what are the divine powers of God? I'll give you an example. Omnipresence, the fact that God is everywhere, is one of the attributes of God. You may have learned that in Sunday school. Well, if you want to be a person, can a person be everywhere? No. I'm here, and I can't be anywhere else. A few of the great saints could be in two places at one time, but two's the most ever recorded. Most people have to be in one place at one time, which means we can't be omnipresent, which means in order for Christ to become incarnate and walk among us, he had to voluntarily empty himself of this divine power of omnipresence. This is what the church says. This is what we receive from the apostles. The apostles taught us that Christ, through kenosis, emptied himself of these things, not that he was a man that God brought up and ascended into some higher power. So this was dealt with early on in the history of the church. But in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and the Jewish religion, the way it had been practiced for a long time, with the temple being the place of sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin, ceased. No temple, no sacrifice, really no Jewish religion. And after 70 AD, there were a lot of very, as you can imagine, concerned, confused, and distressed Jews in the world that were looking for the answer, what do we do now? Many of them became Christian. Some of them formed an even more hard-nosed Judaism, in about 90 AD, but some of them became Ebionites. And apparently these communities received a real shot in the arm of new members after the destruction of the temple. And these three groups knew each other very well. The Jews knew the Ebionites and knew the Christians. They all knew each other. And during the early 2nd century, after about 100 AD, a prayer was added to the 3 times a day Jewish prayer sequence that cursed the heretics. It cursed the Ebionites and the Christians equally. So we think of the church as having been so big all the time, but at this time, it was unclear to the Jews who was actually going to come out on top, the Christians or the Ebionites. Interesting? So, that's Ebionism. It's a Christology of ascent and of adoption, that Christ starts out as just a regular human being, right? There was also some belief among these groups that Christ was a prophet. He started out as a prophet and became something more, very Jewish. Does that make sense? All right? That's the first one. Now we'll go on to a little bit weirder one. It's called Docetism. There was nobody named Docetus. Docetism comes from dokesis, which is a Greek word which means apparition or phantom or ghost. So this was a belief that Jesus walking around on the earth was a ghost, was a phantasm. He didn't really exist in physical form with matter. This was a belief that was based on the idea that the human body was very, very evil. If you think the human body is very evil, then you're going to have a very hard time believing that God would ever become incarnate in a human body, right? So this sounds like it's lost in the sands of time, but I used to be an administrator and ran a Catholic message board where we had thousands and thousands of people that would come on there and argue theology and ask questions. And there was one guy who was on there for years, a longtime member, nice guy. He was a cab driver from Chicago. And after speaking to him for a few months, it became obvious to us that he was a Docetist. He thought that the human body was irretrievably evil and dirty. And he said, God would never, ever, ever have a body. It's just unthinkable. And he would not be converted. He said, no, I could never believe it. He said, if there was Jesus walking around, then he must have been some kind of an illusion. It must have been just a party trick that God did, because God would never, ever have flesh, because flesh is evil. Now, we as Catholics, of course, don't believe flesh is evil. I have some and I like it, right? So we believe that we sin. We can sin with our bodies, but we don't believe that our flesh is irretrievably evil. Now, this is a problem, because if Christ was not incarnate, if Christ did not take on flesh, then what did Christ redeem? And this is what the church says at the beginning. The other thing about Docetism is, because Jesus was a phantom, he didn't have real flesh, then what happened at the crucifixion? And the Docetists said nothing. Maybe it looked like he was being crucified, but that's not what really happened. It was just a show that God put on. So this is Docetic belief. This is Docetism. Now, apparently, Docetism was almost as big a problem, or maybe more, as Ebionism, because in John's first epistle in chapter 4, he actually writes, this is pretty easily paraphrased, how do you know if it's good theology? If it professes that Jesus Christ had flesh, it's good theology. It's essentially what he's saying here. He's saying, don't listen to someone who will not profess that Christ had flesh. If they don't believe he had flesh, then they're not teaching the Catholic faith. Okay? Another teacher who taught against Docetism was Ignatius of Antioch. If you come out of here and you only have one name in your mind, if you only remember one thing tonight, remember Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius is awesome. Ignatius is the coolest dude in the 2nd century. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ignatius, because Ignatius provides a really, really good defense against Docetism. So Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch in Syria. Peter was the first bishop of Antioch, and then 2 bishops later, and then Ignatius was the 3rd bishop after Peter. So Ignatius had been taught the Christian faith by the Apostle John. This is very well attested to. So Ignatius is getting everything right from the horse's mouth. He's a successor of Peter as a bishop after Peter went to Rome, and he learns the faith from John. We know that Ignatius had it right. If you're interested in being a follower of Christ, you don't have a better source for information outside of the apostles than Ignatius. I think every Catholic should know who Ignatius was and where to find his writings, because what happened was, in 107 AD, there was one of these periodic persecutions of the Christians by the Romans, and the Romans were always glad to catch a bishop. You want to stamp out something, you catch the ringleader, right? So they had caught poor Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch. Excuse me. Antioch's a long way from Rome, but they had caught a ringleader, And they knew that the Caesar would want to execute this one himself. So they put him on a wagon in Syria, and they're going to take him on the several weeks long journey to the Colosseum in Rome, where he's going to be killed by wild animals, like Christians were killed at that point in time. So this journey takes weeks, and as they travel slowly through all these towns, the Christian communities in these towns would come out to where the wagon was stopped, and they would bribe the Roman guards. The guards didn't care. They were happy to be bribed. They'd bribe the Roman guards and say, give us a little time with Ignatius. Well, you can imagine guarding this little old man was a pretty easy duty, so the Roman soldiers were happy to drag things out. They'd say, sure. The Christians would bring paper, papyrus, and styluses out, and on this trip, Ignatius of Antioch wrote his letters, his last will and testament. It's 7 letters written to people and churches around the Near East in 107 AD. Okay? 107 AD is only one human lifetime after the resurrection of Christ. The church that Ignatius describes in these letters will blow you away. I was not always Catholic. My wife and I were both received into the church in the late 90s. And a pivotal thing that happened to me that convinced me to become Roman Catholic was reading the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, because I had been raised in the Southern Baptist Church where we were taught very consistently that all of the things those Catholics did were invented somewhere along the way, that all of their offices and all of their practices were invented by the Emperor Constantine or invented by monks in the 7th century. And we had an explanation for everything until I read Ignatius. And when I read about Ignatius, he's writing about the bishops, which are the rulers over the priests and the deacons, who then give the sacraments to the people. He's writing about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He's writing about the Roman Church being the prime church head over all the rest of Christianity. It's all in there. Well, that was particularly what convinced me. So I think everybody should know about Ignatius. But now Ignatius writes one of the letters. He writes to the church at Smyrna, so it's the letter to the Smyrnaeans. And he writes about Docetism, and he says, Docetism is very easy to overcome. He says, what do you consume at Mass? When you receive the Eucharist, you receive the body and blood of Christ. He says, how can you do that if you didn't have a body and blood? He said, if he's just a ghost, then what are you eating? And I think that probably had the same effect upon them that it has on all of us. You're like, well, yeah, that's a perfect explanation of why Docetism can't be true. So, this is Docetism. The idea that Christ didn't have a body, that he wasn't really crucified, but that something else happened. It was a show put on by God. Oh, and by the way, if you've ever read ancient Greek literature like the Iliad, you remember that in that type of poetry, the gods are always playing tricks on people. They're always putting on masks, pretending to be somebody else, lying to people. So Docetism is really more that Greek tradition that, oh, if there's an all-powerful God, he must be playing tricks on us, right? All right, that's Docetism. Now, we'll go to the most famous of all the Christological heresies. You can't talk about Christology without talking about Arianism. That's a picture of Arius. It's a nice hat. So this is happening in 319 AD. Christianity has been illegal until 313. The Romans have been killing Christians and killing Christians and killing Christians. Finally, in 313, Christians can quite literally come out from underground, and finally they enjoy legal status. And so the church says immediately, we have things we have to address. While we've been hiding in the catacombs for our lives, we know there have been heretical beliefs that have cropped up. We know about Ebionism. We know about Docetism. We know about some others. And then shortly thereafter, a priest in Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius, starts to teach and preach in the church a doctrine about Jesus Christ. Now, it's a very technical, philosophical doctrine. However, because Arianism became really, really, really popular, and you might say, why would it become really, really popular? Well, because Christians were mainly poor. And if you kind of wanted to get on this new bandwagon of the emperor's new religion, but you didn't want to associate with poor people, you could become Arian, because they were typically wealthier and better educated. It also happens that among the army that never wanted to be like the common people, Arianism became very popular among the officers in the Roman army. And if you're a grunt in the army and your sergeant's an Arian, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to become Arian and try to impress him. So because of these two twists of fate, what Arius was preaching in Egypt spread over the whole empire. It became really, really, really popular. It was so popular it had a slogan, and everybody knew the slogan. The slogan was, there was a time when the Son was not, meaning he had been created by God. He wasn't eternal, isn't eternal, but he was created by God. Now, this causes a huge fight starting in Alexandria, Egypt, where Arius is. The positions are Arianism, and we'll contrast that with the Catholic position, which is usually called orthodoxy. You may have heard that term. Orthodoxy means basically right thinking or right belief. So we'll call the two sides Arianism and orthodoxy. So in saying that there was a time when the Son was not, Arius is saying that Jesus is really great. He's even divine. He's more than a man. He's somehow God-like, but he's still created by God. And the church said, this can't be right. And this is a really beautiful piece of reasoning. I want you to follow me on this. Arius is saying that God made Jesus, that he's a creature. Now, in English language in our time, that word creature is oftentimes corrupted to mean animal. Creature does not mean animal. Creature, creature, means something created, right? So, particularly, Arius is saying Christ is a created being, and the church says, no, he can't be a created being because we know he's the Son of God. Arius didn't understand, the church patiently explained. How many of you have children? Please raise hands if you have children. You have my condolences. So if you have children, how did you get those children? Oh, go ahead, speak. No, I don't want a technical answer. You got those children by begetting them, didn't you? You got those children by generating them. Now, I know that it's popular right now among certain people to say, use the phrase, make a baby. I hate that phrase. It's philosophically awful. You don't make a baby. You beget a baby, or you generate a baby. Generation is the proper term in English, because if you generate, then that becomes the next generation, right? And those things you hopefully keep hidden in your trousers are genitals. So you use genitals to generate the next generation. That makes sense? A human generates another human, something which is human, alike in substance. And we know that birds generate birds, and bees generate bees, bears generate bears. A Tyrannosaurus rex presumably generated only a Tyrannosaurus rex and nothing else. There is a philosophical similarity in what is generated. What do you make? Well, I could make this. Is it human? No. I can't make anything that's human. I can't create something from nothing which is human. I can only, in a very specific way, generate a human. So this familial relationship implies something very basic. This is why the church has always said that the human family is an image of God's Trinitarian nature. Because when you generate the next generation, they are indelibly and only human. And when the Father generates the Son is God, alike in substance to the Father. And so Arius said, no, 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 no. I'm not saying he can't be alike in substance. And the church said, oh, yes, you are, because you're saying he's a created being. And this is what the upshot of your belief is, Arius. You can't say he's a created being and still say he's the Son of God. These two things are incompatible. Incompatible. And when Christ talks about himself, and when the Father talks about the Son, and when the apostles talk about what they learned from Christ, they always use the word begat, which is the principle of generation. Does this make sense? I love the reasoning of the early church fathers. And so this fight goes on, and there were some heroes in the church that were made during this fight. And I want to give special mention to my patriarch, Athanasius. So Athanasius is fantastic. When it looked like Arianism might actually take everything over, Athanasius, who was a young man in Alexandria, when Arius started this, and later in life he became the Bishop of Alexandria. Arius was a dynamo like the Energizer Bunny fighting against Arianism. And the way he's usually described is it was Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, because sometimes it seemed like he was the only guy that cared. And so Athanasius is another great saint to know. If you ever feel like you're up against overwhelming odds, you should ask the intercession of Athanasius, because he spent most of his life against overwhelming odds. But after Christianity became legal, and we could even meet in public without getting killed for it, the Council of Nicaea was called. Nicaea is a town in Turkey. And so it's actually a nice place. It was nicer to meet there than Rome, which is hot and muggy in the summer, cold and wet in the winter, and stinks really badly. So they had the meeting in Nicaea. 318 bishops from around the world attended the Council of Nicaea. Arius was there, and they let Arius have his say. This is an important principle. The church tries to let heretics have their say. What is it that you're saying? Let us hear it so we can judge it. So Arius went, and he had a say in front of the 318 bishops. Now, one of the bishops there was Nicholas of Myra, the Archbishop of Myra. So he was canonized later. He became Saint Nicholas of Myra. And because he was very, very generous, he's often called Saint Nicholas the Gift Giver. Does anyone want to guess who this is? Okay, so all of our traditions concerning Santa Claus or Saint Claus or Saint Nicholas start with this man. So here's what the real Saint Nicholas was like. He was in the council chamber at the Council of Nicaea, and he was listening to Arius go on and on and on, very confidently explain why Christ was a created being, and it made Saint Nicholas so angry he apparently jumped up out of his chair, ran over to Arius, and socked him in the face. And this is an icon commemorating the greatest punch ever thrown in history, when Santa Claus knocked out the heretic. So the other bishops at Nicaea said, Nicholas, you can't do that. We're trying to have an organized meeting. So they took him away, and they locked him up for the night in a jail cell in the town. Before they locked Nicholas up, they took away his pallium, his sign of his archbishopric, the pallium that the archbishops wear, the white lamb's wool stole. You can see him wearing it there. They took that away. And typically at that time, because papyrus was really expensive, only a bishop would have a copy of the Gospels. They took away his book of the Gospels, and they said, you sit in this cell, and you think about what you did, punching poor Arius in the face, and we're not giving back the signs of your office until you think about it. They came back the next day to let him out, and he had his pallium and his book of the Gospels back. And they said, how did you get those back? And all Nicholas would say is, Jesus and Mary came here last night, and they gave them to me. So they all let him out of the cell, and nobody said anything after that. So the life of Nicholas is associated with a lot of miracles. He's a fascinating saint. Everybody should know about St. Nicholas. So after a month of deliberation, the council fathers, all 318, said, Arius, there is no way what you're teaching can possibly be Catholic. You are going to have to stop. So the council produced the Nicene Creed, and we should all know it because we say the creed every week at Mass. Now, we say a slightly jazzed up version that has had a few other statements refuting a few later heresies added to it, but the guts are from 325 AD. This statement about Christology is so important that we're saying it today, this long after it was created. I've highlighted a few of the phrases in bold here. The Nicene Creed does not only address Arianism, it basically addresses all the heresies that were floating around at that time. So we'll start with the one on top in yellow. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father. Begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. Who's that against? It's against Arius, exactly right. We'll go down to the blue. Who for us men and for our salvation came down and was incarnate. Incarnate means made meat. That's pretty direct. Was incarnate and was made man. Who's that against? The Docetists, exactly. And then the one in red, he suffered, and on the third day he rose again and ascended. Who's that against? Okay. So we can see that all these heresies are being addressed in the Nicene Creed. So Nicaea was very, very important because it was a clearinghouse. All of these heresies had to be addressed so that the people knew who was a heretic and who wasn't. So the heretics had an opportunity to repent, and the people had an opportunity not to wander away from the flock. This is how the church does business. The church has had 21 more ecumenical councils since then, and they're always to address some problem like this. So, we're going to talk one more thing about Arius. Arius and 2 bishops refused to sign the creed, so Arius was exiled to Bosnia. Sounds like a good place to exile somebody to. Arius thought he had been given a real raw deal, so he continued to write letters to the emperor saying, you don't understand, let me explain it to you. And in these letters to the emperor, he would change his theology and change it a little and change it a little until finally he wrote a letter that was basically Catholic. And the emperor said, yeah, sounds good to me, not being a theologian. He said, yeah, sounds good to me. You can come back in. So the emperor sent a letter to the Bishop of Alexandria, who was Alexander at that point, and he said, Arius is coming back, be nice to him. And so Alexander's like, oh my goodness, this can't happen. So Alexander fervently prayed in the church that Arius would please die. And so before Arius starts making his way to Alexandria, he stops off in Constantinople to thank the emperor, and he dies in Constantinople. The contemporary historical reports say that he died in some kind of disgusting spasm. There's really awful reporting about it. And the people, of course, took this to be God's judgment on Arius, that he never made it back to Alexandria in Egypt. And so ends the story of Arius. His heresy went on for hundreds of years afterwards. Again, isolated monastic communities mostly, but there were Arians around for a long time. And I will give 100 points to anyone that can tell me the name of a church that exists in Tyler, Texas that teaches Arian Christology. Bam, the Jehovah's Witness. Thank you. Arianism still exists today in the United States of America. If you read the theological documents of the Jehovah's Witness, they teach an Arian Christology. It still exists today. Oh, that's why if they come knocking on your door, hand them a copy of the creed and send them on their way. Okay, last heresy of the evening. Nestorianism, named for Nestorius, who was the Bishop of Constantinople. That makes this one really embarrassing because he was an archbishop. This is bad. There's Nestorius, very neat clothes. So he held ideas that were so technical that most people who listened to his preaching had a hard time deciding if he was a heretic or not. He was teaching a Christ that had always existed and was of the triune Godhead. And he had all of these terms, but there was one thing that he would not say. He would not agree with the rest of the church that Mary was the mother of God. He just wouldn't say it. In Greek, the term is Theotokos, the God-bearer. It means the same thing as when we say the mother of God. So he would not agree to this, and it caused the other bishops great consternation. They would say, explain to us again why you won't call Mary the mother of God. And he would patiently explain that God was eternal and infinite. There's no way anyone could be God's mother. And they would say, but Jesus is God, right? He would say, oh, yes, yes, absolutely. Then Mary's the mother of whom? And he would say, well, she's the mother of Christ, but not of God. And they would say, so who's Christ in this scheme? And he would say, well, Christ is this part of the union, and God is this part. And it was very, very technical. The explanations that you get from professors about what it was, they usually have to resort to like trying to explain different colors of Jell-O in whether the Jell-O is mixed together. It's crazy trying to find some sort of an analogy to explain in what way Nestorius thought that divinity and humanity were joined together. But it wasn't impossible to figure out that he held a heretical idea because he refused to call Mary the mother of God and said that was impossible. Now, there are a lot of people in Tyler, Texas who refuse to call Mary the mother of God. I'm willing to bet that most of your friends and neighbors who are not Catholic refuse to call Mary the mother of God. And because they refuse, they don't understand our Catholic devotion to Mary. It is vital to understand that our Catholic devotion to Mary and all of the names that we call Mary, Mother of all the living, Mother of grace, things like that, are an affirmation of our Orthodox Christology that Christ is truly God and truly man. When Nestorius refused to affirm that Mary was the mother of God, everybody knew something was up and it had to be addressed. So a council was held in Ephesus in Turkey in 431, and the proceedings of that council are again really technical because they're trying very hard to understand why this is going on in Nestorius' mind. But at the end of the council fathers had to affirm that Nestorius was indeed a heretic. And Nestorius refused to recant. He said again and again, no, you don't understand. And I think it probably was a matter of pride with him. He thought he was the smartest man in the church, and so he thought he alone could understand Christology. But the church said, no, we receive from the apostles that Mary is the mother of God. This is what Elizabeth says to Mary when she greets us, the mother of the Lord. Therefore, we can't go with you, Nestorius. So they sent Nestorius off to a monastery where he lived for some time, again, writing letters. You don't understand. I'm right, I'm right. The followers of Nestorius did not give up even after their patriarch was gone. They schismed. They divided from the church and they formed their own church, which never went away. The modern term for the Nestorian church is the Assyrian Church of the East. It's really interesting. Pope John Paul II had a great desire in bringing all the churches of the world together again into the Catholic Church. So in 1994, he started a dialogue with the Assyrian Church of the East. And the bishops that he sent to go investigate their theology found out that they were teaching Orthodox Christology. They affirmed that Mary was the mother of God, which left kind of a mystery. Did Nestorius actually believe that and he just couldn't explain himself? Or had their theology changed over the intervening 1,500 years? I think probably these people were smart enough that with 1,500 years to consider the problem, they came around to the right understanding, that you can't call Christ divine without calling Mary the mother of God. So in 1994, a pact was signed between the two churches saying, you're all right by us. So that's how long that schism lasted. Now, they're not part of our Catholic polity. It's not totally back together, but boy, we're a lot farther along than we were before that. So, Nestorianism, refusing to call Mary the mother of God. Does that make sense? All right. You ready for the payoff? I'm going to tell you about one person who fell into Christological error. I want you to try to think about this in terms of this human person, because if we make this personal, you can understand why these things are important. So we're in the home stretch now. So I'm going to tell you about one guy. I'm going to tell you about Abu al-Kazim. Okay, I have no idea if you've ever heard of Abu al-Kazim. I'm going to call him Abu from here on because it's very difficult to say his name. This is one man. He was born in 570 AD in the eastern part of the empire, outside the control of the empire in Byzantium. So he's out where heretics would go to be left alone, right? It's in a pagan area where everybody just kind of gets along. So like the Ebionites that existed for so long out in the desert, these are the people that are around him. And he happened to be the great-nephew of an Ebionite priest named Waraka al-Nafal. And this is where he started learning religion, was at the knee of Waraka al-Nafal. And Waraka al-Nafal, being an Ebionite, if you remember this, he would preach a Christology of ascent, the idea that Christ was a prophet who was perfect in his keeping of the law, and therefore he in some way was caught up to God. Okay? And oftentimes the Ebionites would have docetic ideas, so maybe a little Docetism thrown in. He learned the Old Testament, and the Ebionites by this time were using one gospel. They were using an edited version of the Gospel of Matthew. It was really, really hacked up and chewed up. It didn't have the narrative of the birth of Christ. It had a lot of substitutions made. So it was kind of a garbled life of Christ that they were reading. So this is where he learned the faith, was from his great uncle. Because he was poor Abu was an orphan. His parents had died. His grandparents had died. He had no one in the world. He had one uncle, and he had this great uncle. So his uncle, Abu Talib, is a camel trader, and he takes Abu along. He's 10 years old now. He takes him along, gives him a job as his camel boy. So Abu al-Kazim is now taking care of camels in the camel train, and it goes all over the world. And on one particular trip in 580 AD, they were going to Damascus in Syria, and they stopped off in a town named Basra. And in Basra, there was a community of Arian Nestorian monks, people that were followers of Nestorius after the schism, after the council, who had some Arian ideas and some Nestorian ideas. They would have absolutely said it was wrong to call Mary the mother of God. They would have had some weird ideas about where Jesus came from, and they're living in Basra. These monks are fairly wealthy, so when the camel traders would come through, the monks would invite them in to meals. And so the camel traders are all coming inside to have a meal with the monks, and one monk named Bahira saw little Abu outside. He was feeding and watering the camels, rubbing their feet, whatever the camels needed, and he said, no, 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 the boys should come inside too. So he brought Abu al-Kazim inside and made Abu sit with him, and Bahira apparently taught Abu some theology during this stopover in Basra. He taught him some Nestorianism, and he taught him some Arianism. Well, it's a picture there, a picture of little Abu al-Kazim talking to the monks there with the camels and everything. And then later in his life, Abu al-Kazim becomes something of a religious fanatic and mystic. And he says that God's speaking to him. He's speaking to him in his dreams. And so he asked his wife, I don't know what to do with these dreams. She said, you should go see your great uncle, Waraka al-Nafal. He's a monk. He'll know what to do. So Abu al-Kazim goes to Waraka and he says, God's speaking to me. I don't know what to do. And so he and Waraka al-Nafal started to write down some of the things that Abu said God was telling him. And these things were written down. They're called the recitations. And that was written in about 610 AD. And the recitations are kind of weird. They're sort of garbled. Like I said, the Ebionites had the Old Testament, some of the New Testament, but they're really garbled. Like in the recitations, Jesus is Moses' nephew, even though they were 1,200 years apart. And it was the Samaritans that made the golden calf instead of the Israelites, even though Samaria didn't exist at that point in time. And it's chock full of a fruit salad of Christological heresies. You may know Abu al-Kazim by his middle name, Muhammad, and you may know the recitations by their Arabic name, the Quran. Muhammad was a man who learned Christological heresies instead of the actual Christian faith, because he lived in a place where these heresies lived on outside the reach of the church, outside the reach of that shepherd's crook. And so when he wrote the Quran, partially under the tutelage of Waraka al-Nafal, he made this fruit salad of heresy. John of Damascus, also called John Damascene, was the first Christian to really write in a scholarly fashion about Islam. And he wrote that Muhammad was a false prophet, that having chanced upon the Old and New Testaments, and likewise, it seems, having conversed with an Arian monk, devised his own heresy. And in the Quran, you can find examples of all of these heresies. Ebionism. Allah will teach him, that's Jesus, the book and wisdom, the Torah and the Gospel. The idea that Jesus is a man who has to be taught religion by God. You can find examples of Docetism. We slew the Messiah, Jesus the Son of Mary, God's messenger. They slew him not, nor crucified him, but it appeared so unto them. John of Damascus says, and he says the Jews wanted to crucify him in violation of the law, but they seized his shadow and crucified that. If you talk to Muslim scholars today, they'll say, well, maybe it was Simon of Cyrene who was actually crucified instead of Jesus, and God did a presto changeo with their faces. But it's Docetism, the idea that Christ was not, it's mixed up in a fruit salad, but it's Docetism, the idea that it wasn't Christ who died on the cross. You can find Arianism. The similitude or the similarity of Jesus before Allah is that of Adam. He created him from dust, then said to him, be, and he was. John of Damascus explains that, saying, Muhammad says the Christ is the Word of God and His Spirit, but also a creature and a servant. This is straight up Arianism. And the coup de grace, Nestorianism. It's blasphemy, in blasphemy indeed are those who say that Allah is Christ, the Son of Mary. It's basically saying the same thing Nestorius said. You can't call Mary the mother of God. It's all of these particular Christological heresies, tossed in a fruit salad, are what makes up the theology of Islam. Now, Islam, of course, within 100 years of the composition of the Quran, is raiding the entire world. All of the cities that we're talking about from early Christianity, like Damascus, all the cities in Syria, like Alexandria in Egypt, Nicaea, all those are gone within a few hundred years. All the Christians are wiped out there because they're Muslim territories. North Africa, which was the cradle of early Christianity, is completely Muslim. And then in the Middle Ages, Spain and Portugal become Muslim for hundreds of years. And it was only by the barest of margins that all of Europe didn't fall to Muslim invasion. Those wars, the wars of invasion by the Muslims and the few pitiful attempts to go the other way called the Crusades, those went on unbelievably until the 17th century. It wasn't until 1683 that finally at Vienna, the last Muslim army to attack Europe was repulsed. September 11th, 1683, by the way. And this is what happened. This is, when you think about these Christological heresies, you say, oh, all these guys back in the dim reaches of history arguing about these arcane points of who Jesus was. Now, Catholic scholars would say differently. No, you can see the danger of these things because these are two Christologies, they're two theologies. One of a Christ who is God, who takes on our nature and redeems us and makes us better people. And the other is of a sham Christ who's not God and has nothing to give us except follow the law. One creates Christian society, the other Christ creates Islamic society. Okay? And so one example of this is that we as Christians have never, ever, ever, ever allowed any Christian soldier anywhere to force someone to convert at the point of a sword. There cannot be any threatening in Christianity because we believe that can't be right. This comes from our belief that Christ has redeemed humanity by becoming human and thereby enlightening our reason. You can trust people to make the right decision. In Islam, Christ is not divine. He does not take on human nature. He has enlightened nothing. Therefore, people have to be forced to believe the right thing, and conversion at the point of a sword is allowable. That's only one example of how the two differing Christologies create two differing religions and two differing societies. So, that in a nutshell is an example of why Christology matters.